Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, podcasting from the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center in Chicagoland, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Hey, thanks again for joining us for the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. We want to let you know that we had some technical issues with this recording, which is why the audio doesn't sound consistent throughout the interview, but the conversation still comes through clearly, and we're sure you're going to find something helpful and insightful in the conversation. Now let's dive into our discussion with Jen Wilkin. Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name is Daniel Yang, the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and today I think you're going to enjoy our conversation with Jen Wilkin. Jen is a Bible teacher and the author of several books, including 10 Words to Live By, Delighting in and Doing What God Commands, and Women of the Word, How to Study the Bible with Both Our Hearts and Our Minds. Jen's passion is to see others become articulate and committed followers of Christ with a clear understanding of why they believe what they believe, grounded in the Word of God. But before we hear from her, let's go to Ed Stetzer, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and the executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center.
That's a long introduction, but nevertheless, glad to be here. This is actually the last time that I am serving in this role of Wheaton College. We'll continue the podcast, but that's outside. I'm taking a 1 year away from Wheaton College administration and professor. So anyway, glad to have Jen Wilkin in the conversation on the very last one that I'm doing while being the executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center. So you have to change that now. You have to say he's just some guy hanging out. But anyway, Jen Wilkin, a lot of you are familiar. You've engaged Jen's work and more. And so we want to have her on the podcast, and she'd be very gracious to join us. She's written a series of books. We can go through them and we'll link them all in the show notes as always. But we're going to talk about studying and engaging the Bible, passion for Jen, and also ask some questions kind of that flow out of that. I think if you're a church leader, this is going to be helpful for you at multiple levels. It's going to be helpful for you as an engager of the Bible. It's going to be helpful for you as a leader, want to help other people engage the Bible. And we're also going to address the issue of how women might encourage and empower women in engaging the Bible as well. So let's just jump in and start with some questions. What are the primary challenges, Jen, that you've encountered when it comes to helping people engage the scripture? Remember, our audience is pastors and church leaders. So what do you see? What are the challenges? And help us to think those through as church leaders.
Well, I think the biggest challenge that we're facing right now, which is just sort of a product of being in an instant gratification culture, is that people think that learning the Bible should be easy. They think that they should just be able to spend, time in the Word, and that their obedience to actually have proximity to it should yield a particular kind of gain for them. And so I think what we have a lot of times in Christian subculture is the mindset of, if I start my day with my time in the Word, then my day will go well. And if I don't do that, then my day will go poorly. And that is like the 15 minutes or 30 minutes in which I'm supposed to draw something from the scriptures that is going to supply me for that day. And so consequently, the ways that we approach the Bible are often, or even the ways that we go and find, resources that are approaching the Bible are geared toward that mentality. And they're not giving us a long-term sense of what it is to spend time in the scriptures, or a sense that this, like any other spiritual discipline, is something that we labor for. It's something that requires effort on our part. And so I'd say that's probably the biggest obstacle, is that people expect that even though we know that to be a follower of Christ is to take up our cross and deny ourselves and follow him, we think that applies to things like giving our money and allocating our time in the day. And we don't think that it will be hard for us to open the scriptures and draw the necessary wisdom that we need from them.
Jen, when you're talking with young people, especially those who don't really see the relevancy of the Bible to modern life, what do you say to them?
Well, first of all, if someone is feeling that way, I can be pretty certain that they haven't actually been given much of a view of the whole story of the Bible. And so often, especially with young people, what we have done is said, they're really busy. They got a lot of things pulling on them. So they just really need to focus about 10 minutes a day on this. But what they know is that everybody else who's asking something of them is saying that they need to invest significant amounts of time. So, especially think about student ministry, right? Right at the point that high schoolers are being taught foreign languages and chemistry and physics and calculus, and they're spending hours on those topics. And they're also devoting hours and hours to being on travel sports teams or learning musical instruments. We're messaging to them, hey, just give a little of your time to this every morning. And so there's a value statement that's associated with that. This costs you very little, therefore you value it very little. So I often, if I meet with someone who is younger, who doesn't value the scriptures, it's usually, I wouldn't say it's their fault. It's because the person who should have compelled them to value them didn't know how to go about it. And our MO has been to lower the bar at every turn with what we're asking of young people, instead of doing what everyone else is doing, and that's raise the bar and require more of them. People run toward things that cost them something.
It used to be, 10, 20 years ago, things like Bible quizzing and it really helped youth.
10 to 20 years ago. I think it was longer than that. Yeah. Maybe some places still are, but I remember it.
But Bible drills.
Bible drills, sword drills.
Sword drills. Yeah. Like they're not as common anymore. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you're seeing, initiatives that are helpful in helping young people value the Bible and engage it for themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we do at my home church is we make sure to incorporate middle schoolers and high schoolers in the adult Bible study settings, because those Bible study settings are designed for building Bible literacy. And what's amazing is that middle schoolers and high schoolers are learning literacy tools in their English classes at school, but no one has told them that they can use those same kinds of tools to read the Bible. The Bible is magical to them instead of being the inspired word of God that is in book form. And so obviously the Bible is much more than just a book, but it is a book and it obeys certain rules when it is being read. And so we actually help them to feel comfortable with their sacred text when we give them simple literacy building tools like, hey, look up a word in the dictionary, read a book of the Bible from start to finish. Don't pull things out of context. Stay put one place. Know the historical context before you read a particular book. Think about who the author is. Why would he have written from his particular perspective in his particular way? What we've instead given them so often is, hey, just open it up and read a little passage out of it, and then really think hard about it for a while, and then ask how it should change you today. And so for many of us, we've found that we don't actually know after reading it. I mean, good grief, if you're in Leviticus, you're going to do that with your Bible reading, and so then the feeling is, well, gosh, God isn't really showing me anything out of this. So either there's something wrong with me, maybe I'm not a really good Christian, because is this what everybody else is doing and it's working? Instead of having a sense of the Bible is to be approached the way that you would approach any book. It's a very special book, but we approach it the way we'd approach any book, with the same level of respect we would give to the works of Shakespeare or a chemistry textbook. And we start to read it in that way. And then they realize, oh, I actually can do this. And then they begin to recognize that the yield they're going to gain from it, just like the yield from any book, is a cumulative yield. It's not necessarily an in the moment yield.
One of the things that I have used a word to describe you and your ministry and your leading in these conversations is seriousness. I'm like, Jen takes it seriously. There's a seriousness about it. And I think a lot of people don't want seriousness. So they want, light and fluffy and happy. And yet you've really encouraged people to delight. I mean, again, the title of the new book where we would talk some about is 10 Words to Live By, delighting in and doing what God commands, which is, of course, flowing out of the 10 Commandments. So how do I take serious and delight? And you can feel free to use the examples of the 10 Words to Live By. So how do I take the Bible seriously and bring a seriousness to it, and yet find delight in it as well?
Yeah, well, Psalm 1 opens by describing the righteous man as one whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on it he meditates day and night. And I think that we think about meditating on something as sort of like just thinking really hard about it for a few minutes. But what meditating on something is, first of all, it's an act of the intellect. And it's really mulling something over and giving it a chance to expand on you. And so Ten Commandments are a perfect example of how we don't do this, because most of us would give ourselves, if we were grading ourselves on them, most of us would say, well, I get about an 80 out of 100 on that. I haven't murdered anyone or committed adultery. And so that just shows that we have a surface level understanding of what God's commands are really saying, and that we're looking for a bare minimum way of reading them instead of an expansive way of reading them. When we make meditation on them, instead of asking, have I done the bare minimum, we begin to ask, how many ways can I not just be a not murderer, but be a person who is a life giver in all of my relationships and in relationships that I might not even have yet. And that takes time because everything in us is bent toward not doing that. We want to be concerned with trivial matters or with our circumstances at the expense of devoting time to seeing what the scriptures have to say in terms of long-term investment.
I think a lot of church leaders, specifically pastors, they get into a mode of sermon preparation, and that's kind of primarily how they're thinking about Bible engagement. Mm-hmm. What should church leaders keep in mind when they're helping their leaders engage in the Bible, adults engage in the Bible? Like, what should they be thinking that might be most helpful to those that they're leading and shepherding?
Well, I think a really important paradigm shift that we need to have happen in the church, and this is not a new thing, this is an old thing that we need to reclaim, is that we understand the environments that we have in the church as needing to not all be just passive environments. We need active learning environments. And so, especially, I would say even in my own denomination, there's this massive emphasis on preaching, on the preaching event on a Sunday morning. And I'm all for preaching. I think that preaching event matters. But we also need to recognize that what's happening on Sunday morning is a passive learning space. It is not a dialogue. And it's not a place where the people who are sitting and receiving teaching have necessarily done any work themselves before they sit and receive that teaching, which means that people will tend to receive that teaching far less critically than they would if they had actually spent time in the passage themselves before they received the teaching over it. But I would say that over the last 30 or 40 years in the church, we have seen develop an expert-amateur divide. And the expert stands on a platform and communicates the specialized information to the amateurs who sit in the pews. And not only have we seen this, but we have seen both the expert and the amateur embrace those roles fully. The people who are sitting in the pews think that it is the job of the person on the platform to do the work for them. And the person on the platform thinks the same thing too. So the person on the platform basically infantilizes the people who are sitting in the seats, and the people in the seats basically deify the person who's on the platform. Is it any wonder that we see so much cult of personality in the church today and so much disillusionment? Because then when the rubber hits the road, the person in the pews has basically a secondhand understanding of their sacred text at best. So what I think that church leaders need to be thinking about is, how do we get back to active learning environments where we follow a principle similar to what Howard Hendricks articulates of never do for your student what your student can do for themselves. And we begin giving tools to our learners so that we let them see behind the curtain. Like, I don't want people to hear me finish a teaching and think, wow, that was amazing. How did she do that? Yeah. I want people to think, I see what she did there. Yeah. I could do that. And so I think that's the key shift that we need to make. And it's not a shift towards something new. It's actually a shift back toward just a traditional paradigm for how learning takes place in the first place.
But that's killer. And part of it, the reason it's killer is that we have a vested interest in the system as it is.
That's right.
So pastors and church leaders are listening, and we kind of bemoan the fact that people are passive listeners, infantilized audience. But we they sort of want that because they want to come and enjoy that. And we sort of like that. And if you teach them otherwise, it's hard. And it does require a shift. And when I teach preaching, one of the things I try to use as an example is when I was taking the Moody Church through, I think we were just going through the book of Matthew. We were just going through the book. And I went through and I showed how, Matthew's clearly trying to equate Jesus with Israel. Mm-hmm. And I kind of explained to people, just people saying, wow, I never saw that before. And I just stopped and said, and just so you know, that's like in every first year Bible college seminary textbook. So I needed to kind of say to them, this is new news to you. And I really want you to experience the discovery of this. But, you didn't need to hear that from me. This is not, I'm not like, I don't have some special super knowledge. I literally can look at a first year Bible college textbook and see the pattern that Matthew's laying out. So if we're all have this vested interest, pastors love to be affirmed. I love when people come up to me and say, they would say, someone might say, I just never understand the Bible like when you teach it. And my response is, but that's not what we want. We want you to understand the Bible as you read it, engage it, and study it. So how do you kind of break the cycle that really we're all kind of vested in? These pastors and church leaders, listen to me, a lot of them really, I mean, like me, they really like to be told that when people listen to them, they understand the Bible and it's deeply meaningful for them. How do we break that cycle?
I mean, I like that too. I just don't want that to be the only thing that I'm doing. I am further along than my students are. They are going to learn things from me that they wouldn't necessarily see themselves. We know that people in the scriptures are given a gift of teaching. And so we're not diminishing that at all. But we also know that the Great Commission is charging all of us to teach people to obey all that he has commanded. So there is some teaching function just to being a disciple. It's drawing someone along as you were drawn along first. And that means that we have to give people tools, not just information. And I think, as we watch the culture around us grow increasingly post-Christian, people may think that they'll be content to settle for a secondhand understanding of their text, but it just won't sustain them. And we're going to see more and more. I think it's behind a lot of the deconstruction conversation that's happening right now, is that people are abandoning a faith that they haven't ever really even known. And that's not everyone. I think there are legitimate reasons that people are. I think that's a legitimate reason that people are reevaluating things. And I don't think it's their fault. I think that we have not compelled them to something that is more beautiful and deep. We've said, we'll do the thinking and you do the feeling. And feelings are not a reliable, what's the saying? Your feelings are real, but they're not reliable. And so then when things get difficult and I'm looking at my feelings as the gauge of my faith, it's no wonder that people are thrown into a tailspin. We owe our people a reasoned faith, a reasoned belief, a thinking faith. And so I think that's the gift that we can give them, is we're not just training you what to think, we're training you how to think about issues of systematic theology, certainly, but I think also biblical theology. I think when people are able to understand themes that stretch from Genesis to Revelation, it goes a long way to affirm the authority of Scripture, because they understand the cohesiveness of the message and the timelessness of it.
I really like that you brought up the idea of like creating active spaces. And as a church leader, that's, there's Bible study curriculum, there's a small group curriculum. What are some other ways that you're seeing people engage the Bible that's kind of creative, outside the box?
I actually don't think outside the box is what we need. I think outside the box is what we have. I think we have 1,000 different approaches that are drawing people into an encounter with the scriptures that is heart before head. And what we need is to reclaim a more straightforward idea of how we learn. And so, for example, if you go pick up a typical curriculum from the Christian bookstore, and let's say it asks you a question that's difficult to answer, if you've done many of these, you know that you can just keep reading a little further down into the next paragraph and they will answer the question for you, because they don't want you to feel like you couldn't answer the question that was up above.
I feel like you're giving away trade secrets right there.
Because we think that's what people want. Yeah. But again, that is infantilizing. And what we want a good curriculum to do, like if you're the person who's responsible for vetting curricula for your church, for your discipleship arm, you want a curriculum that raises dissonance, not one that relieves it. And this is a real issue with our learners, is that they all own a study Bible and they're accustomed to reading a passage. And when they don't understand what it means, they immediately pop their eyes down and read what the study notes say. And so in the moment that dissonance is created, they relieve it immediately, which sabotages the learning process. Anybody who's in education theory can tell you that moment of dissonance, the moment where you know what you don't know, is when learning begins. And it's something that you have to sit in. I call it dwelling in the I don't know. And when we do that, then our mind is actually prepared to receive the learning that happens when that dissonance is removed. But when we're seeking to mitigate that immediately at every turn, when we're just like Christian Google for them, we're actually holding something back from them that they very much need. So, like if you think about if you've ever been lost in a major metropolitan area, and maybe you couldn't get your map app to open up, And then when you finally get the right route to get there, like that adrenaline rush and that sense of, oh gosh, I don't know where I'm going, is what actually prepares your brain to remember that route for the rest of your life.
Wow. No, and I love it. And again, seriousness. We keep coming back. Again, that's my description of Jen Wilkin. When I'm a professor as of this last 2 more hours, and I keep bringing that up because I'm feeling very excited about that. This will actually come out while I'm on sabbatical, but as a professor, I just got my teacher evaluations, and you've taught class before. You got my teacher evaluations, and do you read them? I read them. Do you read? Okay, I read them. So, and what's interesting is when I read them from the students, I mean, there are critiques here and there, and I actually take them seriously. But the students seem to love when I lecture. But when my colleagues evaluate me, they say I lecture too much. Again, I'm going sabbatical, so I can just go. They say I need to do more learning, experiential learning, a little more hands-on, more conversation, break people into groups, have this kind of conversation. But that's not generally what I get on the student evaluations. However, the research shows, Dr. Laura Barwigan, one of our brilliant professors who constantly tells me I lecture too much, says the research shows that people learn better, even if they evaluate you higher or lower for doing this. They learn better when you don't just lecture. And when it comes to church research, we've actually found that pastors think sermons are the number one things that disciple people. People think it's like number 4. And so pastors, again, this is our audience, pastors and church leaders. It's actually small groups, it's community, it's personal, spiritual growth, things of that sort. But you've got a whole room full of, or an iPod full of pastors listening, and they're not persuaded. So I'm going to go at this one more time because I find you just significantly compelling on this topic because you're a dynamic communicator. So as a dynamic communicator, how do you say in your resources, and we're going to get to your resources in just a moment. In particular, we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about In His Image. I'm going to talk about Women of the Word, some of the other things in just a minute. But how do you as a communicator who's doing video curriculum often make sure this kind of engagement is in what you do?
Well, I construct all of my studies around what I call the 3-legged stool. And so the first leg is individual study time. And as I was describing earlier, that workbook, that work that you're going to do before we get into the rest of the method is going to raise dissonance. You're going to finish answering those questions and you're going to feel like you didn't get straight A's. You're going to want to leave some of them blank, but you're going to hazard a guess because I will have yelled at you to do that in the opening video. And then after you have your personal study time and that dissonance is created, and by the way, I do this in the context of studying entire books of the Bible from start to finish, because we don't want our people to just have spot knowledge of a few passages. We want them to have that context. But then the second leg is group discussion time. So you're going to get together with some peers and you're going to talk about what you learned through that individual time. I jokingly say you're going to pool your ignorance, but that's, it's really so that you can compare and say, well, I paraphrased this way. How did you do it? And see if there's a consensus between you in the direction that you're moving as you walk toward interpreting and applying what you are learning. And then the third leg in the stool is sitting and listening to the teaching time that I give. And that is meant to address, it teaches through the issues that the homework has raised. So you create the dissonance and then you pool the dissonance and then you relieve the dissonance. And the thing is like, because they have spent an entire week in the passage before they hear me teach on it, I can't hurry past the difficult part. Like the challenge before me is so much more exciting to me than when I have to teach a group of people who haven't looked at the passage first. And you're able to do so much more with it because they are invested in the process. So, when you initially make this shift and you start asking more of people, they will say it's too hard and they'll say they don't have time for it. It is a slow boil if you start to introduce this to your church. But I will say that once they have tried it, they can't go back. They can't go back to that other stuff because it just begins to come alive for them and they begin to feel the confidence. I always say that with one of my studies, study of Genesis, I want you to know, have a working knowledge of the book of Genesis when we finish, but more than that, I want you to be more comfortable in any book of the Bible as a result of the tools that you have practiced using in this study once you complete it. So, with preaching, there's only so much you can do to make Sunday morning an more active learning environment. But a big thing you can do is publish the passage you're going to be in the week before so that people can spend the week reading it repetitively. Give them an opportunity to get to it before they hear you teach on it so that they've already done some thinking on it themselves beforehand. With the three-legged stool, if I put that group discussion time after my teaching time, then I know that group is only going to talk about what I taught. They're not going to stretch themselves to talk about what they're thinking and learning on their own. And so it's critical to think about the order in which those things happen to draw students along and to get them to do the work themselves so that they're owning the process.
I love that. I also want to point out, Jen, that while you were talking, some of my colleagues may or may not have been texting, making fun of my iPod reference since I said iPod, but I'm a little bothered by that because that's like right now I could show you that's the coolest fashion accessory right now is old tech like iPods. So don't judge me. Don't judge me. It's retro. I'm like my daughter has. Anyway, moving on from there. So let's change the conversation. I'm not going to mention my daughter. Let's talk about women and the Bible. And again, we wanted to have you on talk about the Bible and Bible teaching. But you specifically have written what really became like a blow up book. I mean, people were talking about it everywhere. Women of the Word, how to study the Bible with both our hearts and our minds. Now, again, we mentioned earlier your writing, we've written multiple books and we're kind of walking through some of the different ones that are here. But talk to me a little bit about, we all study the Bible. Why women of the Word rather than people of the Word? And help us understand some of the nuances there.
Well, I think anyone who's read the book knows that it could have been called People of the Word. But
I tell you, I've read the book.
But I honestly, I can't apologize for it. At the time that it was written, to be frank, I don't know that anyone would have let me write a book that was addressing both men and women. And I think that if it had addressed both men and women, probably neither would have been interested in picking it up.
Fascinating.
And
I think I maybe read it because I felt like I was breaking a rule or something. Donna was reading it. It was on her nightstand, so I stole it.
Yeah. Did you rip the cover off, or did you?
No, I didn't. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't a paper bag or anything. It was good.
Yeah. And so when I have, my whole adult life, I have taught women, and I don't apologize for that. I love it. And if there are men who are helped by what I'm putting out there, then that's great, because the method of study is certainly not gender specific. But at the time that I wrote Women of the Word, it was very apparent to me as a ministry leader that women were being resourced only at the feelings level for almost across the board. And there was no thought among women that they were supposed to bring their minds to their love of Scripture. And that was being reinforced for them. And so they were existing primarily on a diet of devotional content or inspirational content, or they would say, I'm doing this Bible study. And this will still happen to me today. Women will say, oh, I'm doing your Bible study in His image. And it takes everything in me to not say, that's not a Bible study. That's a trade book with some discussion questions at the end of each chapter that you can use in a small group. But we had a habit in women's circles of calling everything a Bible study. And therefore, you had women who had been in church their entire lives who still didn't know the Bible because they were not learning it in any kind of systematized way, or they were just getting it all secondhand through commentators or through inspirational writers. And so I've jokingly called it the pink ghetto. But I have felt called to the pink ghetto, to the estrogen pond. That is my ministry area. And reminding women that when the command is given to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, that is given to both men and women, and that they will not stand before God and give an account for how well they have loved Him with my mind, or their pastor's mind, or Ed Stetzer's mind, or Beth Moore's mind, or whoever. They will give an account for how well they've loved Him with theirs. And so Women of the Word attempts to give them just an entry point to regarding the Bible as a book that is accessible to them and that they can learn over time in ways that are deeply transformational and that are relational ultimately. That we don't learn the Bible for the sake of learning the Bible. We learn the Bible for the sake of learning the character of God and being in relationship with Him.
Yeah, and another thing it does is it gives a vision for young women who feel called to be Bible teachers like yourself, to really have the courage to step into that. And so I'd love for you to speak to church leaders about that. How might they nurture young women who feel called to dive deep into the Bible and to maybe even be a teacher of the Bible? Maybe some of this is your own personal story as well.
Yeah, that's always kind of a funny question for me, Daniel, because what I want to say is, well, you do it the same way that you would do with any young man who is feeling that call. And I think that often we think, oh, I couldn't possibly, the church leaders, pastors think, well, I couldn't possibly, mentor a woman. I mean, that would be scandalous. And I'm thinking, well, where exactly are you planning on teaching her the Bible? In a church conference room, you can sit down and meet with a woman in your church or with a group of women or with a mixed group of men and women and teach these principles. In most cases, it's expanding a circle that it already exists for pastors to include a vision for having women in those learning environments as well. But it is fascinating to me. We have a category in the church, a very well developed category of what it means to be a qualified man in leadership. And I would love for us to have that a similar category for women who are standing up to teach. We vet and think hard about the men that we put in front of rooms. I think we should do the same thing with the women who are teaching in our all-female spaces. These women want to be held to that standard. They don't always know how to gain access to the resources and the training that they need, and they don't always have the confidence to reach out and ask for it because there are sometimes social penalties associated with that. Or even just barriers to entry that might be things like I mentioned, where it's like, oh, I couldn't possibly ask him to meet and help me with this, or he might think that it's inappropriate, or that I want to, step into an area that he doesn't want me in. And so often women need to be invited into those spaces rather than, sitting and waiting for them to emerge and wave their hand in the air.
Yeah, I want to encourage people who are listening, if you didn't listen to a prior episode we had with Kristen Padilla, she talks some about this. She's at the Beeson Divinity School Center for Women in Ministry, and really talks about this because, we recognize people have different theological traditions, complementarian, right, egalitarian, and more. Right. She talks about this is an appropriate path for whatever tradition you're in, is to find that place and space for people to step in. And again, I do want to commend people to hear what Jen just said, also read Women of the Word, but to hear about that important place of development, finding opportunities, and more. One last question is our audience. It's kind of maybe a weird space in some ways. You got pastors and church leaders. It's literally got church leaders in the name. So one of the things that just transparently I have found, I've gone this back and forth weirdness about. Because I really, when I preach the books of the Bible, and I'm really digging into the book of the Bible. I'm loving digging into the book of the Bible, and that can take over my devotional reading. And then I hear people say, Pastor, you shouldn't just read the book of the Bible that you're preaching. And I'm like, but I'm loving this. And then I feel guilty, and I'd start reading another book of the Bible. Oh, and by the way, I don't read the Bible. I don't use a study Bible. I actually have edited study Bibles, but in my personal Bible reading, I can't, because I look down at the note and I'm like, do I agree with that? How would I say that? So I almost like the horse needs blinders on. I need no notes when I read the Bible. But all that to say, what exhortation would you give to the pastors and church leaders who are listening here, who for them, they're engaging the Bible probably in some way at work, in my case, loving it and maybe going even deeper just because they want to go down and learn more, but to make sure that they're not just reading it as a job, as a performative experience, but something more. And maybe even, you don't mind, share a little of your own practice on that as well.
Yeah, I actually get this question a lot. And I sometimes I get this question when I'm on a panel and I hear other people answer differently than I would. And I do think some of the way we answer is related to just personality and personal habits and the way that we think about contact with the scriptures in general. For me personally, I do not distinguish between what I'm doing personally and what I'm doing on a teaching platform. Some of that is because I really need to have meditated on it myself and have it really hit me down deep before I want to stand up in front of a room full of women and exhort them on obedience or draw out the wisdom principle for them. Heaven help me if I'm out teaching my own lived experience of how the scriptures are shaping and forming me. Now, sometimes we have to teach things that we don't have that much experience of ourselves, because when you're teaching entire books of the Bible, you don't get to choose which parts to skip, right? But I also think it's important to be honest about that in that teaching moment, and not not pretend to have had more personal experience of a particular idea than we have. We do want to practice what we preach, or preach what we practice, as much as we can. So I do not distinguish between the two, because for me, the whole process is deeply devotional. It just is. I don't feel like I need a separate thing to give me the feels. And maybe that's selling short, what that other thing could be. But I do know that there are people who feel like if they are preparing it for teaching, it just feels too clinical for them. It doesn't feel like, and that's just not my experience of it. To me, it's all the same thing.
I'm gonna use the phrase "the feels" next time I'm doing my devotional time.
Yeah.
That's a good word. You've been listening to Jen Wilkin. We want to encourage you to check out more about her ministry and her books at jenwilkin.net. Thanks again for listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. You can find more interviews like this one and other great content from ministry church leaders at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast. And again, if you found our conversation today helpful, we'd love for you to take a few moments, leave us a review. That'll help other ministry leaders find and benefit from our content. We'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.